Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, Alex. Before your best-selling book, which impressively is your first book, so congratulations.
Thank you.
You were senior advisor for innovation during Secretary Clinton's entire tenure at the Department of State.
That's right.
Before we get into the book, I wanted to ask you a bit about your time in the government. First of all, did you have anything to do with that email server?
I wish. It might have been, we might have had a little different setup if I were. No. You know, it was funny. When she asked me to come work for her, you know, I'd run technology and media policy for the Obama campaign in 07 and 08, and that went well. And it went well at her expense. So she asked me to then come in and work on her elbow on technology and innovation issues. Unfortunately, when I came, she already had her email set up. So that wasn't me, that was another guy. So for those of you who are here to learn how to set up a homebrewed email system, sorry, you're in the wrong place. The guy who did set it up, though, applied to me for a job, which he didn't get.
You didn't get, okay.
No.
Okay. You worked a lot with Secretary Clinton on internet freedom during the Arab Spring, and were actually involved closely with the late ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, in restoring internet service to Benghazi. Could you talk about your belief in internet freedom and a little bit about what happened specifically in Libya?
Sure. So on internet freedom, you know, it was a conviction of ours that that which was codified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association and assembly, a free press, these rights had to be as real and able to exercise online as offline. And so what we did is we created an internet freedom agenda. We put a couple $100 million worth of your taxpayer dollars behind it for things like proxy and circumvention technologies, which most of you that use those technologies probably don't know it's funded by the State Department, but it is. And we put a lot of really edgy programs in the ground around the globe. In the case of Libya, you know, during the revolution there, the now departed Ambassador Chris Stevens and I, before he was ambassador, one of the problems we had was that Mohammed al-Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi's oldest son, ran Libyatel, and he cut off all the communications networks, not just the internet, but the mobile networks and everything else in eastern Libya at the very beginning of the revolution. So before Chris became ambassador, but when he had his feet on the ground in Libya, you know, my team worked with the Emiratis, with the Egyptians and others, basically to build an ad hoc network into eastern Libya to restore communications, sort of so that the rebels could work together and communicate with the outside world.
Now, obviously, technology can end up in the wrong hands, and the success of ISIS, specifically on the technology front, is something that's sparking a lot of fear in the world right now. What can be done to fight that, in your view?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. I mean, the reason why Al-Qaeda lived and worked out of caves, and ISIS is a huge organization with remarkable recruiting capability and physical territory, one of the biggest reasons for that is in order for Al-Qaeda to communicate with the outside world, what they would have to do is they'd have to make a videotape, which they would smuggle to Al Jazeera. Think about that contrasted with ISIS, who've made remarkably sophisticated use of social media and other such things. And so whether we like it or not, America's technology platforms have been a remarkable enabler for the growth of ISIS. And so what I now think we need to do is, since these are our technologies, and I'm not in favor I don't think it works to just sort of play whack-a-mole and just turn them all down summarily. I would like for us to bring the sophistication we have about how to run these networks and sort of occupy digital territory and use it against ISIS.
So you've been a critic of surveillance per se, and obviously our German hosts here in Germany, privacy is a major concern. I mean, isn't it true, though, that there's going to have to be a certain degree of surveillance to combat terrorism and ISIS?
Of course. And, you know, and look, let me be clear. So two things. First, in my book, The Industries of the Future, one of the key points that I make is that for people who are here, I assume none of you are plotting transnational acts of terror. For you, you all have to worry much more about surveillance than surveillance. You have to worry much more about everybody around you having a video-enabled mobile phone than you do about the BND, the NSA, GCHQ, or others surveilling you. Because bluntly, none of those organizations give a shit what you do outside of plotting transnational acts of terror. So I do think that while the NSA and others have clearly overstepped, and while I think that they continue to need to be reined in, I do think that for everyday law-abiding people, the threat from surveillance is far greater than the threat from surveillance. And I think, unfortunately, as we move from a world of today, in May of 2016, of 14 billion internet-connected devices, to in 4 years, May of 2020, that number will have gone from 16 billion to 40 billion. You know, the surveillance that's going to come from the sensors that line the rooms that we sit in, that, you know, line the streets that we walk and drive down, that are inside the cars that we drive in. I think that those forms of surveillance are really what are going to alter our life in Western democracies more so than state-sponsored surveillance. Now, if you do live in an authoritarian country or in a country that isn't as bound by the rule of law, where things like your political views and other such things are, you know, being captured and you can be imprisoned for, then I do think that surveillance poses an enormous threat.
So getting to your book, you really delve deeply into the issues that will drive the next 20 years of change to our economies. And two of the biggest ones you write are robotics and advances in life sciences. What's going to happen to labor, quite frankly, with the advent of robotics? You know, you get a sense of this feeling of being left behind that's playing out even in America right now during the election.
Yeah, so let me make 2 points about this. I mean, first, most people who write about robotics and artificial intelligence, it's either utopian or dystopian. It's either, oh, we're going to live to be 150 years old, happy, healthy, wealthy, lacking for nothing, kumbaya. Or it's sort of eyes closed, fists clenched, bedwetting. Like, it's either utopian or it's dystopian. And I think life is a little bit more up the middle. You know, we're not going to have a utopian future driven by technology. We're not going to have a dystopian technology driven by future. And I think that in the case of the next wave of automation technologies driven in part by advanced robotics and the next generation of artificial intelligence, I think that I think that it is going to contribute to our overall well-being. But I think that where there are going to be very significant stresses are for non-cognitive, repetitive manual labor. So, you know, look, the first sentence of my book is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'm mopping up whiskey-smelling puke after a country music concert in Charleston, West Virginia. And that's because when I was going to college, and I grew up in West Virginia, while my fancy friends at our fancy college went off and took unpaid internships at investment banks or law firms during the summer, I had to work as a midnight janitor. And so, you know, having grown up in West Virginia as a product of the public school system there and having taught in public schools in West Baltimore, you know, what I believe is that the people who are growing up in those communities who are working class, who are doing manual and routine work, are going to see their labor increasingly replaced. But I also think that that labor that is cognitive and non-routine will increasingly be replaced as well. And so the key then becomes, from both a policy standpoint and from an education standpoint, how and where do we invest to make sure that as different forms of labor are inevitably displaced, people are being trained for those jobs and in those fields where there will be growth that isn't going to be digitized or robotized anytime soon.
So but you're pretty convinced that if there isn't adequate training and rethinking of how we use our workforce and our people, that these forces could contribute to inequality.
Oh, I think that they will contribute to inequality. But, you know, I think that there's some necessary nuance here. I mean, and I won't take credit for the creation of this idea, but Andy McAfee and Eric Bjorn-Olofsson, two brilliant academics at MIT, in their book, The Second Machine Age, do a wonderful articulation of what's called an increase in bounty and an increase in spread. So the introduction of these technologies create more bounty, and bounty not just defined economically, but in terms of longer lives, access to more information and entertainment, more convenience, you know, more better things But the sharing economically of the wealth creation that comes from that will be increasingly stratified. So we are getting more bounty and more spread. So, again, I think back to West Virginia when I was growing up. Only rich kids had color TVs in the 1970s in West Virginia when I was growing up. Today, in the community where I taught in West Baltimore, very poor, everybody has a flat screen color TV that's huge and has 200 channels on it. Their economic well-being has technically not increased, but the bounty available to them at a relatively static income level has. So there's been increased inequality, but there's also been increased well-being. So there's some necessary nuance in all of this.
So as our world becomes you call it increasing codification of our world with computer code, the advent of it everywhere, money and weapons will also be transformed. Let's talk about money for a second. We're writing a lot at the Wall Street Journal about fintech. Could we be actually seeing, there's a lot of debate out there right now, will banking, insurance, these industries that had such high barriers to competition, will they be changed fundamentally?
I think so. I think they are what's next. I mean, if you think about the 20 years from 1995 to 2015, a lot of what was swallowed by software during that time were industries in information and communication services. But the industries that have not to this point been completely swallowed by software are a lot of those that are rooted in transferring value. The role of a lawyer. When my wife and I bought a home two years ago, the process we went to sell and buy a home was the same that my parents went through 30 years ago. 6 weeks for a house closing, sitting with a lawyer, signing a page for 45 minutes. I think that those kinds of processes can and will be swallowed by sort of the next wave of digital tools and leveraging blockchain technology and other such things. I do think that fields like banking and insurance, I do think that they are ripe for new entrants. I mean, if you think about our big banks, J.P. Morgan is literally the name of a guy who lived 100 years ago. Wells Fargo, the stagecoach going west. Nothing could be more evocative of stuff that's really old than our banks.
Right.
And if I were a venture capitalist with a whole lot of money to spend, I would try to create an all-digital bank. And if you wanted to really make money at it, the real headwinds that come from creating these kinds of institutions are principally regulatory. So if you headquarter it in the British Virgin Islands, you put the servers in some other place that basically don't put it under the dominion of Western regulators. I'm not saying that somebody should do this. I'm saying that whomever does eventually do this, they could create an all-digital bank, design it to be HQ'd and its data live outside of regulators, and they could really take off. I also think that in insurance, most actuarial mathematics that undergird insurance models are sophisticated, but we also have data analytics tools today that are far more sophisticated than those that were put in place 40 years ago, which undergird most of the insurance system today. And so look, it wouldn't surprise me if in 5, 6, 7 years, one of the 10 biggest insurance companies in the world or one of the 10 biggest banks in the world are an insurance company or bank that none of us have heard of today.
One of my favorite lines from what you wrote is, whereas land was the raw material of the agriculture age and iron was a raw material of the industrial age, data is a raw material of the information age. How far are we in the big data era? At the very, very beginning, are we seeing big data? Are we seeing the glimpses of how it's going to work?
I think it's very early because it's a very practical matter. When you think about data analytics, the industries that it is largely transformed are industries like advertising.
Yeah.
What I think will be much more consequential is when data analytics transforms fields like agriculture. And I think that we're still relatively young. I think that the technologies that enable us to draw meaningful, actionable business intelligence out of the Pacific Ocean's worth of data that we're creating are relatively new and comparatively unsophisticated. But there's enough capital flowing into it right now that I think some really cool capabilities are being built. And precision agriculture for me is one that gets me really wound up. I think that if we can, I think that some of the investments being made both in the startup community as well as in big ag, by companies like Monsanto and others, thinking about how we can significantly increase yields in a world where water is increasingly scarce, where climate change is wreaking havoc on farming. So I think that analytics applied to fields like agriculture could create some really interesting and positive outcomes. And I think it's ultimately more interesting than analytics transforming advertising or related information fields.
One of the more surprising things in your book to me is the importance you placed on the role of women. That you said that going forward, the utilization of women across the world will be a key indicator of success. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so I didn't set out to write a feminist book, but I traveled the equivalent of 25 circumferences of the globe, 2 round trips to the moon with a side trip to New Zealand. And one of the conclusions that I came to was where the 20th century, the principal political binary of the 20th century was left versus right. I think it's much more descriptive to say that the principal political and economic binary of the 21st century is open versus closed. Defining open as economic and social mobility not being reserved for elites, cultural and religious norms not being set by a central authority, and being very rights respecting of racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and women's rights. And so I think that those open societies, those places that are most open, are where innovators will congregate, where investment will take place, where the subsequent wealth creation and job creation will take place. And women make up half of the equation here. And so I do believe that those states and societies that most advantage women in the economy and in business will be those that are best positioned to compete and succeed. And actually, a month after the book came out, sort of the biggest longitudinal study that had been done on this came out from a center-right think tank called the Peterson Institute, where they surveyed 22,000 businesses. And they actually found a correlation between the composition of women in executive ranks and profitability. And so from my standpoint, the role of women in business is less interesting from the perspective as a matter of fairness.
Right.
Don't do it because it's the right thing to do, kumbaya. Do it because it's in your naked financial interest. And so I think that's the best way to make the argument. And so a lot of people, particularly in the Middle East, really take exception to the book because some of the less than diplomatic assertions I make about those states and societies that disadvantage the role of women in society, but I don't care and I won't apologize for it.
I'd like you all to join me in thanking Alex for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.